welcome to everyone who has joined us from around the world. My name is Tracy Peterson, and I lead the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program. Welcome, everyone. The Outreach Program was established by member states of the United Nations in 2005. We are located in the Department of Global Communications at headquarters in New York. As we begin today's virtual discussion about women in Auschwitz, I have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, as always, we are recording today's discussion, and we will share the recording with you and with all who registered in the next week or so. We will have a section towards the end of today's discussion for questions and answers, and I would encourage you to place your questions in the Q&A section. Please indicate, along with your name, if you're comfortable to do so, from where you're joining us. And should we not get to answer all the questions, we will endeavor to have Dr. Cushman respond, and we will share the answers with you after the event. It is my pleasure now to ask His Excellency Mr. Krzysztof Szczerski, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Poland to the United Nations, to give welcoming remarks. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning to actually just a midday to everybody joining us, and my warm regards to Dr. Kushner for joining us in this very important, I believe, and discussion that will raise up the awareness of the faith of women in the concentration camp, especially in Auschwitz. So let me say these few words of introduction. Well, on January 17th, 1945, just 10 days before the liberation of Auschwitz, nearly 19,000 female prisoners stood for the last roll call in Auschwitz, the main camp, Birkenau, and sub-camps, including pregnant women, women with small children, and adolescent prisoners. Those who were able to march were led out of the camp and driven on foot to Wodzisław Śląskie, approximately 60 kilometers away. Women who were unable to walk and the further weak, lagging behind and delaying the march, were shot, and their bodies were left by the road. They were buried in numerous mass graves by the local population after that. Those who reached the railway station in Wodzisław Śląski were loaded onto the open coal wagons and taken to KL Ravensbrück and KL Bergen-Belsen. That was one of the last acts of the barbaric fate of the women of Auschwitz, as I said, 10 days before the camp was actually liberated. Between 1932 and 1944, approximately 131,000 women were imprisoned in the women's camp in Auschwitz, of whom almost 65% was Jewish, deported from different countries. Nearly 5% were Polish, over 8% were of Roma, and over 5% of representatives of the other nations. The women who were sent to the camp could not have imagined the horrors that awaited them. Until 1933, pregnant women were routinely sent to the gas chambers or executed immediately. Later, those who survived childbirth within the camp were forced to endure the agonizing deaths of their newborns, succumbing to disease, starvation, or direct murder. Yet, amidst this brutality, some women displayed extraordinary resilience, fighting fearlessly to protect their children, to protect their faith, to protect their dignity. Auschwitz was also the site of horrific medical experiments conducted on both men and women. These experiments, including sterilization and infectious disease testing, often resulted in death and permanent injury. Pregnant women and children were subjected to particularly invasive and painful examinations. And let me use this opportunity just show you one picture of a young Polish girl, Czesława Kwoka, who was murdered at the age of 14 in Auschwitz. But look at her face. This is this is the picture that really stays with me from the very first moment I saw it. Look at this innocent young girl. Along with her mother, Czesława Kwoka was deported from her village and transported from a resettlement camp in Zamość general government to Auschwitz on December 1942 during the Operation Zamość, which were initiated in November that year to create the Lebensraum for Germans in Eastern Europe. On 12 March 43, less than a month after her mother's death, on February 18th, Czesia was murdered at the age of 14. The circumstances of her death were not recorded, but reports indicate that the cause of death was a phenol injection to the heart, the very heart of this young, innocent girl. And she was just one of more than 1 million people who lost their lives in the German Nazi concentration extermination camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau. On January 27 this year, the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau, we honored the memory of over 1 million of lives extinguished within its walls. Jews, but also Poles, Roma, and individuals from countless countries and nations were murdered simply for who they were, where they came from, and what they believed. For many women, liberation did not bring the end of the suffering. They carried the scars of emotional trauma and debilitating diseases contracted within the camp. They faced the devastating reality of the lost loved ones and shattered homes, and many never fully recovered. For nearly 80 years, Poland has worked to preserve the memory of Auschwitz. We treat ourselves as the guardian of this memory. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, established in 1947, stands till today as a vital testament and educational resource for the world. It's our moral obligation to safeguard this site, not only as a memorial to the past, but as a crucial lesson for the future generation. And saying so, in a conclusion, let me recall just two people that actually came to this anniversary commemoration in Auschwitz this year. First is the words of Tova Friedman, an 86-year-old survivor who arrived at Auschwitz with her mother at the age of 5. Even now, she remembers the desperate cries of the women around her. Today, she declared during the 80th anniversary commemoration, we have an obligation not only to remember, but also to warn and to teach that hatred only begets more hatred, killing more killing. Another speaker at this commemoration, Stefania Wernik, one of the last surviving eyewitnesses, although she has no memory of Auschwitz. She was only a few months old when the Auschwitz was liberated. As Wernik puts it, she was born into hell. In April 1944, her Polish mother was caught smuggling and sent to Auschwitz. She was 2 months pregnant and kept it in secret. When it was discovered, she was allowed to have her child under extremely difficult circumstances. Stefania Wernik weighed only 2 kilograms, 4.5 pounds at birth. During her speech in January, she said, "Never again war, never again fascism. You must remember vigilant. You must remain vigilant so that nothing like this ever happens again. I was born in hell in Auschwitz-Birkenau." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Szczerski, for your thought-provoking and very moving remarks. Thank you. Dear audience, we're very pleased to have with us today eminent historian, Dr. Sarah Cushman. Dr. Cushman is the director of the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University and is the senior lecturer in the history department there. She served as head of educational programming at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, and before that as director of youth education at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Dr. Cushman is the recipient of several fellowships, including from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She is on the executive committee of the National Consortium of Directors of Centers in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, and is a member of the Illinois Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Dr. Cushman's book, Women in Auschwitz, is under contract with the University of Indiana Press. She is also the co-editor of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook on Auschwitz-Birkenau and is co-editor-in-chief of Holocaust Studies, a journal of culture and history. Good afternoon, Dr. Cushman. We're very pleased to have you with us today. And I'm going to dive right in and begin with a question that we have for you. And our topic today, as you know, has as its focus Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is possibly the most well-known camp. And Auschwitz-Birkenau, as we know, was the largest of the Nazis' 6 death camps. Could you begin by telling us why Auschwitz-Birkenau, along with the other 5 death camps, is referred to as a death camp?
Thank you so much, Ms. Peterson. And thank you so much, Ambassador, for your kind words of welcome. And thank you to everyone for being here. I also would like to thank the United Nations for the invitation to speak here and for the opportunity to share a little bit about my research. Let me just share my PowerPoint here. Hopefully everybody can see that now. And with regard to the question about the death camps, so yes, as many of you know, the Nazis established a wide array of concentration camps, a very large concentration camp system, in which the various camps had a variety of functions: labor, confinement, POW camps, transit camps, etc. 6 of these camps distinguished themselves, or the Nazis used these camps as places for mass murdering primarily Jews. And Auschwitz was one of them. Auschwitz, there were 4 camps that were established solely for the purpose of killing Jews, primarily the Jews of Poland. And those were Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And then Majdanek and Auschwitz were a little bit different in that they were both concentration camp, labor camps, and places of genocide.
Thank you for clarifying that for us. And if I could move to my next question, which, you know, most research in a way has focused until now, has focused on the Nazi men who ran the camp. And some research has focused on prisoner experience and the use of prisoners to run the camp. And women have only rarely been at the center of studies of Auschwitz. Could you tell us something about the women's section of the camp, its founding and locations, and identifying the various groups of women who lived and worked there?
Thank you so much, Ms. Peterson, for this question. Yes. So Auschwitz, the camp itself, was founded in July of 1940, shortly after Germany invaded Poland and started World War II. Auschwitz initially held male Polish political prisoners and several hundred male German prisoner functionaries. The functions and area of Auschwitz increased over the next 20 months. It became a place of agricultural and industrial development, as well as a location of political executions and mass murder. Genocide became a primary function, really only beginning in the summer of 1942. Eventually, the Auschwitz zone of interest incorporated roughly 25 square miles, which included 3 primary camps: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II Birkenau, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, as well as 6 smaller agricultural or industrial subcamps. Auschwitz had an additional 35 subcamps that were farther afield. The women's section of Auschwitz was founded on March 26, 1942. The first group of prisoners were 1,000 women sent from Ravensbrück to supervise other women prisoners. Ravensbrück was the main women's camp inside the German Reich. The first Jewish women prisoners came later that same day from Slovakia, which also sent male Jews to Auschwitz. For the first several months, these transports included only young, able-bodied Jewish people sent to Auschwitz for labor. When the women's camp was founded on March 26th, Hitler had been in power for 9 years already, since 1933. Jews and women had become an increasing percentage of the overall camp population, so the entire camp system, beginning in 1938 and 1939, respectively. World War II had been underway for about 2.5 years, September of 1939. And Auschwitz was a Nazi camp for almost 2 years, since July 1942, as I had mentioned before. Nazi policy towards Jews, towards the Jews of Europe had been genocide for several months only, since somewhere between June and September of 1941. And Auschwitz was not yet a central location for the genocide. The women's section initially was in the main camp in blocks 1 to 10, which were separated by a fence from the rest of the camp. In August of that year, with the population overflowing, the women's section moved to Birkenau. Eventually, the women's section expanded into all of Birkenau section B1. Just go forward for a second. And women at various times lived and worked in the main camp in its 1944 extension, various sections of Birkenau, and all 6 of the local agricultural and industrial subcamps: Babice, Bobrek, Budi, Harmensay, Plavi, and Raisko. There were 3 primary groups of women in the Auschwitz camp complex: women prisoners, privileged women prisoners, which included women functionaries who supervised the other female prisoners, and women prisoners who were affiliated with the SS, which was the Nazi paramilitary organization in charge of the Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Tracy, I turn it back to you for the next question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cushman. And if you don't mind, I'm going to call you Sarah.
I don't mind at all.
Sarah, great. Sarah, thank you. I mean, and that was such a detailed answer. And one of the things I just want to pause and reflect on is that, what you've illustrated to us also by showing us those really useful maps is that when we talk about Auschwitz, that we, begin to understand that that there are many, many subcamps. And then even looking at Auschwitz-Birkenau itself, you've just helped us to understand a little bit more of, just how vast this whole endeavor was. And you've mentioned now 3 groups of women who were in Auschwitz. And I wonder if you could describe, and I'm sure already now people are intrigued by those who were, who were the prisoners, who were the so-called privileged. Could you describe the existence of the prisoners, who they were, what their living and working conditions were like? And then how did they respond to these conditions? And then the last question for now is, what about their experiences was different from those of male prisoners?
Tracy, if I may, thank you so much for the question. So women prisoners came from a variety of backgrounds and from all across Europe. They included Jehovah's Witnesses, antisocials, asociale, as in German, criminals, POWs, Romani people, Polish people, and a multiplicity of Jews. And Jews came also from all across Europe. They were assimilated, converted, observant, Hasidic, Orthodox. The Jews that came to Auschwitz spoke a variety of language. They came from a variety of countries and cultures. And they had filled a variety of occupations and educational levels and income levels. So Auschwitz, the prisoner population in Auschwitz was a very diverse prisoner population. The SS marked the prisoners with triangles. You can see a representation of here on the screen. And these triangles indicated their prisoner category. They indicated how the Nazis viewed them. Sorry, let me go back there. Non-Jews, simply because they were not Jewish, had some privileges that Jewish prisoners did not. One of the most important was that after April of 1943, they were no longer subject to gas chamber selections. They still perished in large numbers for other reasons, but not subject to these particular gas chamber selections. Also, unlike most Jewish prisoners, they still had family alive outside of the camp with whom they could correspond and from whom they could receive care packages. These were really important forms of sustenance. In addition, Gentile women were sometimes prioritized to fill functionary positions, and I'll discuss what those are in a few minutes. Jews comprised the majority of the population in the women's section for the entire duration of the women's section. This was because over 1 million Jews were sent to Auschwitz. Most were never admitted to the camp. Transports of Jews underwent selections upon arrival, where an SS doctor selected most Jewish people for murder in the notorious gas chambers of Birkenau. 80 to 90% of Jews, including visibly pregnant women, children, the elderly, the sick, and disabled, were among those who were murdered immediately. All of their belongings were stolen by the Nazis for their own use. Only a small percentage of Jews were admitted to the camp. These were women the SS perceived could perform labor. New arrivals, Jews and many Gentiles as well, underwent a humiliating initiation process of disrobing, disinfection, head shaving, and tattooing. Women experienced this process as a form of sexualized violence. Not only were SS men present, verbally attacking and often groping them, but they also felt that their femininity had been destroyed by this process. Jews were also subjected to gas chamber selections throughout their time as prisoners. These selections took place at daily roll calls or in prisoner infirmaries. Women perceived as no longer fit for work were chosen for murder. Sometimes they were forced to wait for days in Block 25 in the women's section before they were sent to the gas chambers. The conditions in which women, Jews, Roma, and other Gentiles were forced to live in Birkenau will be familiar to many of you. The barracks were crowded and filthy. Women had little access to hygiene and toilet facilities, which were located far away, of insufficient number, and did not regularly have flowing water. Their clothing was minimal. Their food rations were meager and insufficient to sustain life. Women were also subject to hard labor on outside work details, which often took place far from the camp itself. This meant long forced marches, and regular exposure to weather extremes. Women were also subject to violence and humiliation from camp guards, men and women alike. The result of all of this was disease, starvation, and death. Most women perished within 3 months of their arrival. Men imprisoned in Auschwitz faced similar conditions, although many claimed that conditions in the women's section were always just a little bit worse. And women faced some vulnerabilities that men did not face. As the ambassador mentioned, pregnancy was something that could consign a woman to the gas chambers immediately upon arrival. Some women were allowed to bring their babies into the world. But for most women, once their pregnancy was discovered, if it had not been discovered on arrival, or if they became pregnant after arriving in the camp, as soon as their pregnancy was discovered, they were killed. One of the things that some women prisoners who became pregnant, or women who worked as nurses or doctors in the camp, in the prisoner infirmaries, decided to do to try to save the life of the woman, they either performed an abortion or committed infanticide. This was an extremely difficult decision for these women to make, and many concluded that this was the least unethical thing for them to do in this situation. To try to save the life of the mother was an imperative. At least one life could be saved. Menstruation also posed a problem for women. As most of you know, most women who were imprisoned in Auschwitz ceased menstruating due to malnutrition. But for the few who continued to menstruate, or the ones who regained their health in some of the positions that I'll talk about later, there was very little ways to maintain their hygiene. If it was noticed by guards that they were bleeding, they were often subject to violence. And most women both because of the cessation of their menstruation or the continuation of it, feared damage to their long-term reproductive capacity. Many feared that there had been an additive put in their foods to suppress their menstruation or to suppress their libidos. And then also there was fear of medical experiments. And so this long-term fear of damage to their reproductive capacity was based in some kind of reality, because these medical experiments, many of them which focused on ways to mass sterilize people. The medical experiments themselves were not only women were subject to these medical experiments, but there were some particular ones that women were subjected to. Also, women feared sexual assault, and there were some sexual assaults that were carried out by various groups of men, including prisoners, SS men, as well as civilians who ran the factories nearby. And then, of course, there were brothels. There were brothels for SS men, and there was a brothel for the prisoners. Women prisoners didn't typically serve is the wrong word, but they didn't usually work in the brothels for SS men. They were conscripted to work in the prisoner brothel. They were promised release after 6 months. That was not honored, and so I consider this as a form of sexual slavery. I think I'll stop there and ask for your next question, Tracy.
Sorry, classic mistake. I think we all need just a second to pause and, what you've illustrated and spoken to us about also just reminds us that of the unthinkable choices that women were having to make, that no one should ever have to make, and just the vulnerabilities that existed. I think we're all reeling. It's very hard to hear. So I want us now to, having paused and taken a breath, to perhaps step slightly to one side and talk about the women who survived Auschwitz, because there were thousands who survived, now, including Jewish women. And of course, against these odds, how was it possible that women survived? And what strategies did women use to survive? If you could maybe just expand a little on that for us, please.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd be happy to. Well, happy is not the right word either, but this is one of the areas of my research. So prisoners, men and women alike, had strategies about how to respond and survive. And many of these strategies were similar for men and women. They tried to maintain their health and hygiene. This was an extremely difficult thing to do with the lack of running water, etc. One of the strategies that they used was that they often received a ration of tea or coffee in the morning. And instead of drinking this, they would try to use it to wash themselves. This was something that they all realized wasn't actually improving their hygiene, but it fed in some ways their morale. It helped to keep their morale up. It was a way of them feeling like they were trying to combat the dehumanization that they experienced in the camp by maintaining some kind of dignity, some kind of routine around hygiene. Also, most prisoners had strategies around food. The food rations were extremely small: a bowl of soup, a chunk of bread, some tea, and most prisoners had strategy of either trying to eat everything all at once, eat their entire ration, so they would have a moment where they felt at least somewhat full. And others had the strategy of trying to stretch this very small ration throughout the day. But almost everybody approached it in one way or the other. Neither option was particularly effective in staving off feelings of hunger, but they did try those. And actually, another strategy that they used with food was to share recipes with each other. And often these recipes would make them feel like they were cooking something and like they were sharing something important with their fellow inmates. Also, most prisoners had some kind of strategies around work. They would try to slow down or stop work entirely when those who were supervising them looked away. They also tried to avoid the attention, the ire, the violence of the people who were supervising them. They tried to stand in the middle. They tried to, not stand out in any way at all. And then, of course, there were some social strategies. Men and women alike tried to form social bonds with the prisoners around them as a way to maintain morale, companionship. And some of the things that they did in these social groups was to share humor, culture, education, religious practices. All of these really fostered a sense of identity and community that were ways of countering, other ways of countering the dehumanization that the Nazis were heaping upon them. One of the ways that so men and women alike tried to form these social bonds. Men's social bonds tended to be smaller in groups of 2 or 3, and women's social groups tended to be a little bit larger. And they formed family-like groups where there was sometimes a camp mother, camp sisters, camp daughters, occasionally camp brothers or fathers, even though there were women in these roles. And then another sort of vulnerability or opportunity, depending on the person and the situation, was sexuality and barter. So barter was a regular part of camp life. There was a thriving black market in Auschwitz, and prisoners would exchange usually bread. Some had, a very few had cigarettes. They would exchange those for some other item that they might need. A better quality of food, a pair of shoes, a sewing needle and thread, a writing utensil and paper. So often they would use bread. Occasionally, some women would use their bodies, their sexuality to gain those items. Sometimes sexual barter was engaged in with other women prisoners. More often, it was engaged with men. There were a very small number of male prisoners who had access to the women's camp. These were usually people who were doing some kind of construction, plumbing, locksmithing, some kind of skilled labor inside the women's section. And when they interacted with the women, there were opportunities for these kinds of things to take place. But really, there were only 2 ways that could have a significant impact on longer-term survival, and those were getting a better job or acquiring a camp function. It's important to note that Jewish women who arrived in Auschwitz before the summer of 1944 and survived probably had privileged positions in the camp. Better jobs were typically jobs that were inside the camp or at a permanent assignment to a subcamp, as opposed to the outside work details that would go to some of those subcamps from Birkenau. The benefits of these jobs were that women were either spared a long walk to work, did not have to toil in inclement or extreme weather, had less exposure to violence or increased access to food. Some better jobs included several or all of these benefits. Such jobs included processing prisoners into the camp, shaving their heads or registering them, kitchen work or agricultural labor where they could access more food, or factory jobs where the labor was often repetitive and exhausting, but undercover from the elements. Each of these benefits, more food, less walking, being less exposure to the elements, decreased daily discomforts, and increased an inmate's very slim chance to survive. Camp functions were positions that involved a more official exchange of labor for benefits. Camp functions included supervision of prisoners on work details. These functionaries were often known as capos. There was also supervision of women inside the camp or the barracks. These were the bunk seniors, also known as Stubenälteste or Stubova, block seniors, also known as Blockälteste or Blockova, and camp seniors, a Lagerälteste. Secretaries were also camp functionaries, and they were employed by the SS in all sections of the women's camp and in various SS offices and offices of SS enterprises. In exchange for their work, these women received more food, better sleeping quarters, sometimes access to showers and laundry, freedom from heavy labor, decreased subjection to violence, and access to some power, and increased, although still highly constrained, autonomy. Because of these various privileges, especially their power over other prisoners, they were often viewed by other women prisoners as agents of the camp authorities and as sharing their goals. Because some utilized and sometimes were required to utilize violence, other women almost universally saw them as violent and perhaps even as more brutal than camp guards. Also, because they had access to food and hygiene and sometimes could grow their hair out, they were viewed as pretty and often also as sexualized. And indeed, some women, as I mentioned before, were able to have sexual encounters. What I didn't mention is that sometimes women in privileged positions were able to engage in sexual encounters for pleasure, companionship, and then also for sexual barter, as I mentioned before. Most women who did so, who engaged in these kinds of sexual behaviors, were in privileged positions. It is important for us to understand, however, that most of these women did not actually identify with the SS. So while common prisoners saw them as being a part of the camp structure, which kind of makes sense, it's important for us, looking back at them, to understand that they weren't, while they were part of the camp structure, they were not in cooperation with the SS, and certainly even if they appeared to and sometimes behaved in abusive ways, their agendas were not those of the SS. I think it's important for us to remember that they took these jobs primarily to try to survive and to try to help their families to survive. It is also women in privileged positions who had the energy, health, autonomy, and access to resources to participate in broader resistance. I do consider some of those responses that I mentioned earlier as forms of resistance, sort of daily resistance or spiritual resistance is how some historians talk about them. But this kind of broader resistance where people could focus on sort of a little bit bigger picture resistance, it was most of the women who were involved in that were women in these privileged positions. The organized resistance in the women's camp was focused primarily on mutual aid, trying to help others to survive. For some, this help focused on members of their political, religious, or educational circles. Some, however, focused on a broader array of women. The organized resistance among women was relatively non-hierarchical, meaning there weren't really leaders or followers, although there were some who were better connected. And there were some women who had connections with the resistance in the various resistance groups in the men's camp. And the men's groups tended to think more about escape, with an idea of telling the world about what was happening in Auschwitz, or armed rebellion, which the intent was to try to stop what was happening in Auschwitz and Birkenau. Escape and armed rebellion were extremely rare among women prisoners. There were hundreds of escape attempts by men, and really relatively very few by women prisoners. There were some women who may have tried to escape from a subcamp in late 1942. And there were also some women who smuggled gunpowder to the Jewish men who were forced to toil in the gas chambers in crematoria and Birkenau. This group is known as the Sonderkommando. And the Sonderkommando used that gunpowder to set fire to one of the crematoria during an attempted rebellion in October of 1944. One Jewish woman was known to have had a successful attempt, and at least one other tried to escape but was caught shortly after leaving. For the most part, women prisoners involved in resistance tried to help each other to survive. I'll stop there, Tracy, and ask for your next question.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think that's such a powerful last note that you left with us, that, that resistance was surviving. That was really ultimately what was the main form of resistance. And I think also something in your answer, Sarah, again, just, despite the Nazi attempts to at every level dehumanize women, how that we cannot forget. And this is where the history that you are working on is so important, because it gives us examples and reminds us that in the face of all of that, how extraordinary that women insisted on their humanity. And I think also that it was important for you to remind us that at every level, even if the women may have appeared privileged, ultimately it was about how they were staying alive. And again, to remind ourselves but this was in a context that was completely and utterly abnormal. And so the sort of judgments that we might pass in a relatively normal society, one has to actually remember the context in which these women were trying to survive. So thank you so much. So you've discussed women prisoners with us, and those in the general population of the prisoners, and the privileged prisoners, privileged because they possibly could live a little longer because of the work that they were lucky enough to have been given. But it seems that women affiliated with the SS have not frequently been the subject of scholarship. And can you tell us about these women and what were they doing in Auschwitz? How did they relate to the prisoners? And how did they relate to the SS and to the genocidal purposes of Auschwitz-Birkenau? I wonder if you could shed some light on that.
Thank you, Tracy. There were 3 groups of women who went to Auschwitz to work in and for the camp, mostly German and Austrian women. There were camp guards, communication specialists, and nurses. The latter 2 had virtually no interaction with prisoners. The 4th group of women in Auschwitz connected to the SS were SS wives. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these groups. Most women guards were trained at Ravensbrück, which I mentioned previously was the main women's camp in Germany. Their training was meant to last several weeks, but was often inconsistent. It included some indoctrination that focused on prohibitions of fraternizing with prisoners. They earned relatively high pay for positions that required few skills and little education. They also had quite a bit more power, at least over some people, than many women in civilian society could obtain. These benefits, however, did not seem to counter the regimented military lifestyle, and recruitment of women guards remained a challenge to the SS throughout the war. Eventually, they resorted to conscription, often just conscripting women who were working as supervisors in factories. They would send them off for guard training and then bring them back to the same factories to supervise the forced labor that was already there. In Auschwitz, women guards oversaw the women's camp and women's labor. Male guards, however, provided the armed cordon that aimed to prevent escapes. There was little hierarchy among the guards other than the appointment of a head woman guard. The first was Johanna Langefeld, who was quickly replaced by Maria Mandl, who served until shortly before the evacuation of Auschwitz in January of 1945. Excuse me. Guards lived in the staff building, the Stabsgebäude, near the main camp, which also housed some privileged women prisoners. The guards lived 2 to 3 to a room. They received uniforms, outerwear, boots, and had access to bicycles and other forms of transportation. Much of the hierarchy among the women camp guards was based on where they worked. As with prisoners, the women guards preferred work that was inside a building or inside a camp. They too hoped to avoid inclement weather or the long walks to and from places to where they were working. Communications experts were a small contingent of highly trained and indoctrinated Nazi women who worked as radio, telegraph, and telephone operators. They trained in a facility in Alsace. These women were considered part of the SS. They had to meet SS racial standards and were meant to be a pool of spouses for SS men. They were recruited from Nazi organizations for women and girls. And I think it's important to note that these were highly committed Nazis. There's very little information about their lives in Auschwitz. It's unclear where they were housed, but their housing was probably similar to that of women guards. They worked in an administration building that was close to the main camp. As I mentioned before, they had no interaction with prisoners, but they could see into the main camp, and they transmitted information about the operation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I mention this just so that we understand that these women knew what the purposes and functions of Auschwitz were, and were committed to those goals. SS wives were also committed members of the Nazi elite. It's unclear what percentage of SS wives came to Auschwitz, but there were a significant number who resided there. They lived with their husbands in houses or apartments near the main camp, and they provided a domestic retreat for their husbands who ran Auschwitz. They also lived a lifestyle that was probably unobtainable to people of their sort of educational background that more than they could have received before the Nazi rise to power. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And then the nurses in Auschwitz received various types of training. Some, but not all, were affiliated with the Nazi nursing service. All of them did have to sign an oath of secrecy about Auschwitz. They worked in the SS infirmary, which for most of the duration of the camp sat near the Auschwitz main camp. They had some interaction with prisoners, primarily with male Polish prisoners. It is clear that they knew about it's clear also that they knew about the functions of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And then I just want to talk a little, as we sort of wrap up here, just talk a little bit about the participation of these women in the project of genocide. So SS women were not tasked with genocide, but they found ways to contribute. And we see this happening in other contingents of Nazi women that were sent to the Nazi-occupied East, tried to find ways to, even though their roles were supposed to be somewhat constrained, they found ways to participate in the Nazi project. Excuse me. The ways that they contributed in Auschwitz specifically depended very much on their roles. That the SS had a hard time attracting women guards did not decrease their brutality. Women guards were notoriously abusive to women prisoners. They humiliated women physically, sexually, and psychologically by extending roll calls and forcing them to perform calisthenics, among other mistreatments. This, in some ways, was sort of an indirect contribution to genocide. The most direct way that they participated was by participating in gas chamber selections. This was definitely an advancement of the genocide. Communications experts had no interaction with prisoners. They had no opportunity to be brutal. They demonstrated their commitment to Nazism, however, in their interest in enrolling in the communications corps, even in the first place, and by enjoying their status as racial elites. I see them very much as sort of bureaucratic perpetrators, kind of the Adolf Eichmanns of the female corps. Highly committed Nazi women who were never tasked with frontline killing, but had they been, may have carried out killings. SS wives exploited prisoner labor in their homes for childcare, cooking, and cleaning. This is an aspect of the livelihood that I was talking about, the sort of level of luxury that they would not have been able to obtain in other eras of history. They too were committed Nazi women who were invested in the work that their husbands carried out, and hoped for the success of the genocide and the Nazi project in Eastern Europe. Nurses were nonviolent participants who nevertheless became complicit by their ongoing presence in the camp and their support for the SS men who worked there. Not all that women could that nurses had some kind of choice in how they behaved is demonstrated by the fact that one nurse, Maria Stromberger, was an active member of the resistance, and another nurse that she reported about, who had interacted with female prisoners at one time, was extremely brutal. So we see this kind of array of behavior among these women. I think I will stop there and ask for your next question, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, it's again, you're reminding us that these, just in some of the photographs that you show us, and also the roles that women took, nurses. There's a photograph with, clearly a mother holding a child, and that, that they were not just complicit, but actively supportive of the genocidal intention and knew exactly what they were doing. And it is very hard for us sometimes to have to reconcile that exists, So thank you for reminding us yet of the just how complicated and complex the story is. I want to turn before going over to, and we have some questions from our audience, I want to turn the spotlight back on you as a researcher. And I wonder if you could talk to us about some of the challenges, if any, you faced in researching the history of women. Was it harder, for example, do you think, then to find their histories than, say, for example, men, be they the male victims, the male perpetrators? I wonder if you could talk a bit to that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Tracy. I think with regard to women who were targeted by the Nazis, I think that access to documents is roughly the same. And a lot of memoirs, a lot of testimonies that get into sort of the people's personal experiences and their responses and how they viewed the people around them, prisoner functionaries, guards, etc. I think some of the obstacles were related to the fact that I try to look into some really sensitive topics like sexual activity. Female sexuality is something that a lot of people are really, really uncomfortable with. And so asking questions about that, or trying to find testimonies in which the interviewers ask these kinds of questions. That was I mean, it's a very sensitive area. It's a very sensitive topic. And so wanted to be thoughtful about that and considerate, and then also acknowledge that some of the, until probably the 90s, not a lot of people were asking questions about sexuality and sexual violence. And then the questions tended to be mostly about sexualized violence, not about sexuality. This idea that women might engage in sex for something other than like a purpose that was outside of sexuality itself, was sort of taken as a given, and that's a given that I tried to question a little bit. There also, when I started doing this research, there was a relatively small amount of secondary sources. This topic has really burgeoned in the last 2 decades or so. There's quite a bit of secondary information out there now. And I think one of the places where I've really had a hard time finding information is about women affiliated with the SS. So about guards, there's some information, but about their personal and private lives, how they viewed what was going on there, I've had a really hard time finding any sources that really speak to that directly. And that goes for the communication specialists, the guards, the nurses, and the wives. There's just not much that I've been able to find about their experiences that's from them. There's some information about the private lives of SS wives, but yeah, that's been a major obstacle, I would say.
So Sarah, I know that you've come to the end of your PowerPoint, so I wondered if you would like to stop sharing your screen at this point, because
yes.
I think we'll no, that's thank you again for such rich answers to our questions, and I think we'll go over to some of the questions that we've received. Kaori Ozawa asks, was there any individual woman's experience that particularly impressed you, and I think or made an impression on you in your research that you remember that you could share with us?
Wow. Gosh, there's so many. There's this one woman. There's a couple of women who. There's a woman who her name is Helen Spitzer. Her married name was Tichauer. She was interviewed by Boder very shortly after the war. She's just a very, very interesting person in the camp. She was on the second transport from Slovakia to Auschwitz. She was working in the outside commandos in that summer of 1942, and a chimney fell on her, and she hurt her back, and she could no longer work in the outside commandos. But she was someone who really did not want to supervise other prisoners. She didn't want to become she didn't want to. The way she talks about it is that she didn't really want to take that responsibility or have that burden of supervising other prisoners. And she had been a graphic designer by training, and she was able to it's like a sort of couple of happenstances. She was able to get a job painting the stripe. There was a red stripe that some prisoners had down the back of their prisoner uniform. She was doing that. She was one of the first. She was one of the only women in the camp who could actually knew how to mix paints. Mixing paints was a thing back then. It was you had to put the materials together to make the paint. It didn't come prepackaged. She was one of the few people who knew how to do that. And because she was a graphic designer, she ended up doing some of the prints of the numbers that went on people's uniforms. And then she ended up working in close proximity with a woman named Margot Drexler, who was sort of kind of an important woman camp guard who worked in close proximity with Maria Mandel. And she ended up making she worked in this office and had a relatively privileged life in Auschwitz. She ended up making a model of the women's camp, and she claimed to have hid documents before the evacuation of the camp. And she had a perspective. She could see some of the ways that women were resisting, and she was also friends with a woman named Katja Singer, who worked close. She was also on the second transport with someone who didn't identify as Jewish, but the Nazis identified her as Jewish, and she was very high in the women prisoner hierarchy. And there's some evidence that both Katja and Zippy manipulated numbers on the prisoner files so that people who were already dead would be put on the quotas to be sent to the gas chambers and so on. She's a really fascinating character. I shouldn't say character. Very fascinating. Zippy was a very fascinating woman. And after the war, she ended up in various countries, finally in the United States, in New York, and was someone with who that had a very kind of interesting and important perspective on the women's camp in Auschwitz. So her story kind of stands out to me in terms of its uniqueness. But I have to say that like almost all of the stories of survivors, I find really actually, and people whose stories that I know, I found find really touching, like including the stories that the ambassador shared with us earlier, really emotional and heart-wrenching. And in my work, I didn't do so much today, but in my written work, I really do try to bring individual voices into the history that I tell.
And
thank you for the question,
Sarah. Of course, and Sarah, there are a couple of people already who are saying, when will your book be published? Because I think everybody would really like to read more about these individuals that you pointed out.
Thank you. Hopefully 2026.
Okay, we can wait.
So not too long a wait.
And Evelyn Cantor, thank you for your question. Evelyn asks, can we assume the structure and experiences were similar for women prisoners in other Nazi camps? I see Evelyn mentions Theresienstadt, which of course was not a death camp. It didn't mean women didn't die there or because of the conditions, but wasn't a death camp. But perhaps just very quickly, if you could expand on respond to that question. Thank you, Evelyn.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, I think the context does matter. I think, yes, I would say that there were some similarities in terms of sort of the particular vulnerabilities of women in these various camps. I would say the major difference between Auschwitz and these other places is exactly that it was a death camp. The prisoner labor that was exploited there, particularly the Jewish prisoner labor that was exploited there, it was understood that these women were not to survive, and so any kind of how do I want to say this? That there was, on the part of the guards and the functionaries, there was a freedom, for lack of a better word. There was a permission, let me put it that way, permission to be as brutal as one wanted to be. So yes, some general experiences that were similar in terms of those vulnerabilities, but that overarching idea that these people were going to die imminently was not there. And then Theresienstadt was a very particular place. That was a place that had an internal prisoner camp structure that was I don't want to say free of the SS, but freer of the SS than a place like Auschwitz was. There's an excellent history of Terezin called the Last Ghetto by Anna Haikova, which I recommend, which gets into a little more detail, and she deals with sort of gender and gendered experiences in that camp. So yes, some similarities, some differences. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. Yes, of course. And I am now going to have to, I'm afraid, because we have run out of time, but there are a number of questions, Sarah, that we will share with you. And I'm looking, for example, at Shulamit Reinhardt's question who asks, did women's origins become a source of friendship or even antagonisms? And she says, for example, the Western origin women or women from the East, the Ostjordan. Scott Jacobson asks, is there a consistent theme of women having to adapt constantly depending on the context in which they find themselves, whether roles, what work they had, the survival strategies, or even personas? So that whole thing of women having to adapt all the time. And we referenced Judith, and dear audience, you can go into the Q&A section and you'll see these questions that I'm referencing. Judith points people to a Paul Heller conference, and there are questions about whether you've interviewed any of the women who worked for the SS, and have what, if any were still alive. So there are a number of questions which we will make sure, dear audience, that Dr. Cushman gets. We also, there is a question that came in right towards the end from Naomi Silva. How can we leverage your research to generate broader awareness and support efforts to combat modern day anti-Semitism? And we also look at the post that Hannah kindly shared with us, the story of her grandmother, Hannah Berkowitz. Thank you, Hannah. My grandmother entered with Hungarian Jews in April-May 1944. She was not murdered until September, but no other record exists of her entry. Someone suggested that she might have been barracks of women to be traded, but who never were. Is there more information on particular barracks? And I think that's the sort of question that, even if you're not like Hannah, where you don't have a direct link, it's the sort of answer, Sarah, that we'll be very interested to hear from you. And so, dear audience, our esteemed ambassador who has joined us, thank you so much and of course our thanks to our historian, Dr. Cushman. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. My colleague Bo Lee will be posting a link to a survey which we'd ask you, if you have time, to complete. We will be sharing this recording, as I said, in the next week or so, and we wish all of you well. Thank you again, Dr. Cushman. We yet again can see how Holocaust remembrance has an important role to play, not only in countering hate, as the ambassador pointed, to remind us that you have to counter hatred where it appears, because hate begets hate. And so for those reasons, it's important. You've also reminded us of the human beings in the history, and for that we thank you very much. And so it is now 4 minutes after the hour. It is my great pleasure to thank you all and to wish you well until we meet again. Goodbye.